Sometimes the greatest acts of love come from those who have the least to give. In the unforgiving Arizona desert, a magnificent stallion lay dying while wealthy ranch owners and experienced hands stood by helplessly, shaking their heads in defeat. They had tried everything money could buy, the best veterinarians, the finest medicines, every trick in the book. But when a weathered cowboy with empty pockets knelt beside the broken animal, something different happened. He didn't see a lost investment. He saw a precious soul worth saving. What exactly made this simple man succeed where everyone else had failed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This incredible tale of courage and compassion will remind you exactly why the human heart can accomplish true miracles. The desert sun had already claimed 2 hours of the morning when Jake Morrison rode his aging sorrel mare into Copper Ridge, Arizona. Dust kicked up from the hooves of his horse, settled on his weathered face, adding another layer to the permanent tan that spoke of decades under open skies. At 58, Jake carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned to read the world through experience rather than books. His clothes told the story of countless towns, countless jobs, faded denim worn soft at the knees, boots that had walked more miles than most automobiles, and a leather saddle that had molded itself to both horse and rider through years of partnership. The saddle was perhaps the most honest thing about Jake Morrison. Hand-tooled leather, darkened by weather and time, bore the marks of a working life. Every scratch and stain held a memory. A difficult colt in Texas, a cattle drive through Colorado mountains, nights spent sleeping under stars when no bunkhouse would have him. Unlike the fancy gear he saw on display in the town's leather shop, Jake's saddle had earned its character through service. It represented something that money couldn't buy, authenticity forged through genuine experience. Copper Ridge stretched before him like a settlement caught between two worlds. The main street bustled with the usual mix of miners, ranchers, and merchants, but even Jake's untrained eye could spot the growing influence of wealth. New buildings rose with architectural pretensions far beyond what the desert demanded, their fresh paint and ornate details standing in sharp contrast to the practical adobe and timber structures that had served the town for decades. The telegraph wires hummed overhead, carrying messages that connected this remote outpost to distant cities where men made fortunes they'd never have to work for with their hands. At the far end of town, beyond the modest homes of working families, the Blackwood ranch spread across the valley like a declaration of prosperity. Harrison Blackwood had arrived in Arizona territory 15 years earlier with railroad money and eastern connections. Unlike the cattlemen who had carved their spreads, from raw wilderness, Blackwood had purchased his empire with banknotes and business contacts. The ranch house itself resembled something transported from a Philadelphia suburb: white columns, manicured gardens, and a circular drive that announced the owner's distinction from his dusty neighbors. Jake had heard about Harrison Blackwood. During his journey south, saloon talk painted the man as shrewd but fair, a businessman who treated his ranch more like an investment portfolio than a way of life. His cattle were prize stock imported at considerable expense, his horses bred. For both beauty and bloodline, everything on the Blackwood ranch served a purpose that could be measured in dollars and cents, from the imported bulls to the ornamental landscaping that required constant irrigation in the desert climate. Sarah Blackwood, Harrison's 26-year-old daughter, had grown up in this world of careful cultivation and calculated refinement. Educated in San Francisco and well-traveled despite her youth, she possessed the kind of polished confidence that came from never having to question her place in the world. Yet those who knew her well recognized something restless in her manner, a searching quality that suggested her father's wealth had not quite filled whatever space existed in her heart. She managed the ranch's social obligations with grace, entertaining visiting dignitaries and business partners with the skills her finishing school education had provided. But those closest to her noticed how her attention wandered during conversations about stock prices and property values. The ranch hands who worked for Harrison Blackwood were a different breed from the drifters and seasonal workers common to most spreads. Blackwood paid well and expected both competence and loyalty in return. His foreman, Luis Martinez, had been with the ranch for 8 years, longer than most men stayed anywhere in that country. Martinez understood cattle and horses, but more importantly, he understood his employer's expectations. The Blackwood ranch operated with the efficiency of a business enterprise where every decision was measured against its impact on profitability and reputation. Jake's arrival in Copper Ridge followed the same pattern as his entrance into dozens of other towns. Over the past decade, he asked few questions, made fewer promises, and let his actions speak for whatever character he possessed. The local saloon keeper provided the essential information: who was hiring, who paid fairly, and who might need help with difficult animals. In a territory where horses meant survival and transportation, a man who could gentle difficult stock or coax life back into injured animals never lacked for work, even if that work paid poorly. The morning sun climbed higher as Jake made his way to Martinez's office, a small building adjacent to the main barn that served as headquarters for ranch operations. The office smelled of leather oil, hay, and the strong coffee that sustained men who began their days before dawn. Martinez looked up from his account books with the measured gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating strangers. Jake's appearance, dusty, weathered, but carrying himself with quiet dignity, fit the profile of countless drifters who move through the territory seeking work. "You're Morrison?" Martinez asked, his voice carrying the slight accent that revealed his origins south of the border. "Yes, sir. Heard you might need help with your stock." Martinez studied Jake's hands, noting the calluses that came from years of rope work and the careful way he held himself, signs that suggested competence without arrogance. Mr. Blackwood's particular about his animals. "These aren't range horses. You can break with a rough hand. Some of these animals cost more than most men earn in a year. I understand expensive stock requires careful handling," Jake replied. "I've worked with thoroughbreds and Arabian bloodlines. My approach focuses on building trust rather than breaking spirit." The conversation that followed established the basic terms of employment. Jake would start with the general herd, proving his methods before being allowed near Blackwood's prize animals. The pay was fair, the expectations clear. What neither man discussed was the subtle class distinction that separated hired hands from the social world of their employer. Jake had encountered this division before, the invisible line that separated those who worked with their hands from those who owned the land they worked. As Jake settled his horse in the employee quarters, he became aware of the ranch's most prized possession, Midnight, a magnificent black stallion whose bloodline traced back to champions on 3 continents. The horse represented everything Harrison Blackwood valued: beauty, breeding, and substantial monetary investment. Midnight had been acquired not just as breeding stock, but as a symbol of the Blackwood Ranch's commitment to excellence in every aspect of its operation. The stallion moved with the fluid grace of an animal born to greatness, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian under the desert sun. Yet even from a distance, Jake's experienced eye detected something in the horse's manner that troubled him. Midnight's interactions with the other ranch hands seemed forced, lacking the natural partnership that characterized a truly content animal. The horse performed as required, but without the joy that Jake had learned to recognize in animals who truly trusted their human companions. That first evening, as Jake tended to his own mare and familiarized himself with the ranch's routines, he found himself studying Midnight with the attention of a man who had spent his life learning to read the subtle signals animals communicated. The stallion's physical condition appeared perfect, well-fed, expertly groomed, housed in accommodations that rivaled the homes of many humans. Yet something in the animal's eyes suggested a spirit that wealth and careful breeding had not quite reached. Jake's worn leather saddle, now resting on its assigned rack in the tack room, seemed almost shabby beside the elaborate gear that equipped the Blackwood ranch. But as he ran his fingers along its familiar curves, Jake felt the satisfaction that came from tools earned through honest work. His saddle had been shaped by countless hours of patient labor with animals who had learned to trust him, not because of the equipment he used, but because of the intentions he carried in his heart. The desert evening settled over Copper Ridge, with the quiet beauty that had drawn men to this hard country for generations. Stars emerged in the clear sky with a brilliance unknown to those who lived beneath the gas lamps and coal smoke of distant cities. In that peaceful moment, Jake Morrison had no way of knowing that within days his humble presence would challenge everything the wealthy town thought it understood about the relationship between money and true value. The third day of Jake's employment dawned with the promise of spectacle. Harrison Blackwood had organized a demonstration for potential buyers from California, men with railroad connections who spoke of expanding their breeding operations westward. Midnight would be the centerpiece of the exhibition, a living testament to the quality of bloodstock that money could acquire and careful management could maintain. Jake watched the preparations from his position near the working corrals, noting the unusual bustle of activity around the main exhibition ring. Servants had been dispatched from the house to arrange viewing areas with imported chairs and Persian rugs spread beneath canvas awnings. A photographer from Tucson had arrived with his bulky equipment, prepared to capture images that would accompany future sales materials. Everything reflected Harrison Blackwood's attention to presentation, his understanding that perception often mattered more than substance in the business of selling dreams to wealthy men. Sarah Blackwood moved through the preparations with practiced efficiency, ensuring that refreshments would be properly served and that her father's guests would lack for nothing during their visit. Yet Jake noticed how her gaze kept returning to Midnight, as if she sensed something in the stallion's demeanor that concerned her. The horse stood perfectly groomed in his stall, his coat brushed to mirror brightness, his tack gleaming with fresh oil and careful attention. To most observers, he appeared the very image of equine perfection. The buyers arrived in a cloud of dust and self-importance, their carriage imported from St. Louis and their clothes tailored in San Francisco. They spoke in the measured tones of men accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of dollars with casual ease. Their examination of Midnight focused primarily on his physical attributes: the powerful chest that promised speed, the elegant lines that suggested noble breeding, the documentation that traced his ancestry back through generations of champions. Harrison Blackwood conducted the proceedings with the confidence of a man presenting his finest treasure. He recited Midnight's impressive statistics, his racing victories as a younger horse, his successful coverings, the premium prices his offspring commanded at auctions throughout the Southwest. Every detail had been researched and verified, every claim supported by official documentation. In the world of horse trading among wealthy men, such credentials mattered more than intuitive understanding of animal nature. The demonstration began with Midnight under saddle, ridden by the ranch's most experienced horseman. The stallion moved through his paces with mechanical precision, responding to each command with the trained obedience that expensive education had instilled. His movements were technically correct, displaying the breeding and conditioning that justified his substantial value. The buyers nodded approvingly, discussing bloodlines and potential stud fees with the detached professionalism of men evaluating industrial equipment. Jake remained at his assigned distance, but his trained eye caught details that escaped the casual observers. Midnight's ears moved with subtle tension, his breathing carried an almost imperceptible irregularity, and his gait showed microscopic variations that suggested something beyond mere performance nerves. The horse was executing his required routine, but without the fluid enthusiasm that characterized an animal in perfect harmony with his work. The collapse came without warning. One moment, Midnight was cantering in a wide circle, displaying the controlled power that commanded premium prices. The next, his legs buckled beneath him with the sudden finality of a structure whose foundation had crumbled. The stallion went down hard, his massive body striking the ground with an impact that sent dust clouds swirling across the exhibition. Ring! The sound of his fall, a crushing thud followed by labored breathing, brought immediate silence to the assembled crowd. Chaos erupted with the kind of desperate energy that accompanies the potential loss of something irreplaceable. Harrison Blackwood rushed to the fallen horse, his face already calculating the financial implications of what he was witnessing. The visiting buyers stepped back with the instinctive withdrawal of men who preferred to observe disasters from a safe distance. Sarah ran toward Midnight without regard for her carefully arranged appearance, her concern focused entirely on the suffering animal, rather than the social embarrassment his collapse represented. Luis Martinez took charge of the immediate response, dispatching riders to summon every available veterinarian within 50 miles. His shouted orders reflected both professional competence and growing desperation. Midnight represented not just Harrison Blackwood's investment, but the ranch's entire reputation for maintaining premium livestock. The economic consequences of losing such a valuable animal extended far beyond the stallion's purchase price to encompass future sales, breeding contracts, and the intangible but crucial matter of the Blackwood name in territorial horse circles. The first veterinarian arrived within 2 hours, a competent man whose services commanded high fees throughout the territory. Dr. William Hartley had built his reputation on successfully treating valuable animals for wealthy clients, combining formal education with practical experience gained during 15 years of frontier practice. His examination of Midnight was thorough and professional, utilizing both traditional techniques and modern instruments imported from Eastern medical schools. Hartley's diagnosis painted a grim picture. Midnight appeared to be suffering from a combination of exhaustion and what the veterinarian termed nervous collapse, a condition that affected high-strung thoroughbreds subjected to excessive breeding demands and performance pressure. The horse's vital signs were weak but stable, his responses sluggish, his general demeanor suggesting an animal whose spirit had somehow become disconnected from his physical form. The treatment protocol that followed represented the best that money could purchase in 1887 Arizona territory. Expensive medications were administered, specialized equipment was deployed, and additional consultants were summoned from as far away as Denver. Harrison Blackwood spared no expense, authorizing expenditures that would have supported a working family for several years. Every intervention followed established veterinary science. Every procedure was executed with professional competence. Yet Midnight continued to decline. A second veterinarian arrived by evening, Dr. Marcus Fleming, whose reputation extended throughout the Southwest. Fleming brought different theories and alternative treatments, approaching Midnight's condition from the perspective of a man who had studied in European veterinary schools. His techniques were more modern, his equipment more sophisticated, his confidence more pronounced than his colleagues. Fleming's efforts proved equally ineffective. Despite the application of advanced medical knowledge and expensive imported treatments, Midnight remained unresponsive to human intervention. The stallion lay in his specially prepared stall, breathing steadily, but showing no interest in food, water, or the humans who worked desperately to restore his vitality. His eyes, once bright with intelligence and spirit, had become dull with what appeared to be profound resignation. By the second evening, the mood around the Blackwood Ranch had shifted from urgent optimism to grim acceptance. The visiting buyers had departed with polite expressions of sympathy and private relief that they had not yet completed their purchases. Word of Midnight's collapse had spread throughout the territory with the speed that bad news always traveled. carrying implications for Harrison Blackwood's business relationships and future prospects in the horse trade. Sarah spent long hours beside Midnight's stall, her usual social responsibilities forgotten in favor of a vigil that reflected her genuine affection for the suffering animal. Unlike her father's primarily economic concerns, her distress was personal and immediate. She had watched Midnight grow from a spirited young stallion into the ranch's crown jewel, had seen him reduced from magnificent vitality to this heartbreaking state of inexplicable decline. Jake Morrison observed these events from his position among the working hands, maintaining the respectful distance that his employment status required. Yet his attention remained focused on Midnight, with an intensity that his fellow workers began to notice. While others discussed the likely outcome with the resigned acceptance of men accustomed to losing animals to forces beyond their control, Jake studied the stallion with the careful attention of someone who saw possibilities that others had missed. In the faded blue ribbon that hung in Midnight's stall, a memento of his championship performance at the territorial fair 3 years earlier, Jake saw more than a symbol of past glory. The ribbon represented what Midnight had been when passion and purpose had aligned, when the stallion's natural abilities had found expression through joy rather than obligation. That capacity for greatness remained within the horse, waiting for someone who could reach beyond medical procedures and expensive treatments to address whatever deeper need had been left unfulfilled. As the third night settled over the ranch, and the expensive veterinarians prepared their final reports, Jake Morrison made a decision that would challenge everything the wealthy community believed about the relationship between money and healing. Tomorrow, he would ask permission to try where science and wealth had failed. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard when Jake Morrison approached Luis Martinez with a request that would have seemed presumptuous from any other. Eye at hand, the ranch foreman stood outside Midnight's stall, his weathered face reflecting the resignation of a man who had witnessed too many animals beyond the reach of human help. The expensive veterinarians had departed during the night, their final consultations confirming what everyone already suspected, that medical science had exhausted its options. "Mr. Martinez," Jake said, his voice carrying the quiet respect that had characterized all his interactions at the Blackwood ranch, "I'd like permission to spend some time with the stallion." Martinez studied Jake with the careful attention of a man whose job required him to evaluate both horses and the humans who worked with them. "The doctors say there's nothing more to be done. Mr. Blackwood's accepted that we're probably going to lose him." "Sometimes doctors see the problem differently than the animal experiences it," Jake replied. "I've worked with horses that medical men gave up on. Not saying I can help, but I'd like the chance to try." The foreman's expression revealed the internal conflict between professional skepticism and desperate hope. Midnight represented more than a financial investment. The stallion embodied the ranch's reputation for maintaining the finest livestock in the territory. Losing such an animal would damage Harrison Blackwood's standing among his peers and potentially affect the ranch's ability to attract premium breeding contracts. "What exactly are you proposing to do that 2 qualified veterinarians couldn't accomplish?" Martinez asked. Jake removed his hat and ran his fingers through graying hair, considering how to explain an approach that defied conventional wisdom. "I've noticed that sometimes when an animal shuts down like this, it's not just physical. Something in their spirit gets broken, and all the medicine in the world won't fix that. I'd like to try reaching him through patience and presence rather than treatments and procedures." Martinez glanced toward the main house, where Harrison Blackwood was undoubtedly calculating the costs of his loss and considering how to minimize the damage to his business relationships. "Mr. Blackwood's not going to appreciate having a hired and interfere with his prize stallion, especially after spending a fortune on professional veterinary care." "I understand the position that puts you in," Jake said. "All I'm asking is permission to sit with the horse. No treatments, no procedures, just time and attention. If he doesn't respond, we haven't lost anything. If he does, Maybe we can give him a chance." The conversation that followed revealed Martinez's own doubts about the expensive medical intervention they had witnessed. Despite their impressive credentials and sophisticated equipment, the veterinarians had approached Midnight as a collection of symptoms rather than as an individual animal with particular needs and sensitivities. Their treatments had been technically correct but somehow impersonal, focused on the condition rather than the creature suffering from it. Jake's request presented Martinez with a choice between following established protocols and allowing an unorthodox experiment that might offer Midnight's only remaining hope. The foreman's decision reflected both practical wisdom and intuitive understanding of animal nature. "You can spend time with him," Martinez said finally. "But if Mr. Blackwood objects, this conversation never happened." Jake's first approach to Midnight's stall demonstrated the patience that had characterized his work with difficult animals throughout his career. Rather than entering immediately, he positioned himself where the stallion could observe him without feeling threatened. From his vest pocket, he withdrew a simple wooden whistle, hand-carved from desert mesquite during long evenings around campfires. The whistle had accompanied Jake through countless jobs, its familiar weight and smooth finish representing the kind of personal connection that mass-produced items could never achieve. The whistle's soft tone carried none of the sharp commands that typically characterized human interaction with horses. Instead, Jake produced gentle melodies that seemed to blend with the natural sounds of the desert morning. Wind through the mesquite, the distant call of quail, the subtle rustle of small creatures moving through sagebrush. His music held no expectations, demanded no responses, simply offered companionship to an animal who had been subjected to too much human intervention. Midnight's initial reaction was barely perceptible, a slight shift in the position of his ears, a minor adjustment to his breathing pattern. These subtle changes would have been invisible to casual observers, but Jake's experienced eye recognized them as the first signs that the stallion was beginning to acknowledge his presence. After 30 minutes of patient music-making, Jake allowed the whistle song to fade into comfortable silence. The ranch's regular activities continued around them with the steady rhythm of a well-organized operation. Ranch hands attended to their assigned duties. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, and the business of maintaining Harrison Blackwood's investment proceeded without interruption. Yet something had shifted in the immediate area around Midnight's stall. The desperate urgency that had characterized the previous day's medical interventions had been replaced by a different quality, calm attentiveness that suggested possibility rather than defeat. Jake's approach to Midnight required nothing more sophisticated than time and genuine interest in the animal's welfare. He spoke in low, conversational tones, sharing observations about the weather, the desert landscape, and the small details that filled a working man's days. His voice carried no false cheerfulness or forced optimism, simply the authentic presence of someone who understood that healing sometimes required nothing more than patient companionship. Sarah Blackwood discovered them during the afternoon, her usual route through the ranch buildings, bringing her past the stall where Jake maintained his quiet vigil. She paused at a respectful distance, noting how Midnight's posture had subtly changed since morning. The stallion's head was no longer hanging with complete dejection. Instead, he appeared to be listening to Jake's gentle conversation with the kind of attention that had been absent since his collapse. "Has he shown any improvement?" Sarah asked, her voice reflecting genuine concern rather than mere curiosity. Jake looked up from his position beside the stall, his eyes reflecting neither false hope nor premature celebration. "He's listening. That's more than he was doing yesterday." Sarah's education in finished manners had not prepared her for conversations with hired ranch hands, but her concern for Midnight overrode social conventions. The veterinarian said his vital signs were stable, but that he had lost the will to recover. They suggested that sometimes valuable horses simply give up when subjected to too much pressure. Animals are more sensitive than people give them credit for, Jake replied. They feel things we might miss, stress, expectations, the difference between being valued for what they are versus what they represent. Maybe Midnight just needs to remember that someone cares about him as more than an investment. The simplicity of Jake's observation struck Sarah with unexpected force. Throughout her life, she had been surrounded by beautiful objects and valuable possessions, each carefully maintained for its contribution to the family's status and wealth. The possibility that Midnight might be suffering from the same kind of emotional neglect that sometimes left her feeling isolated despite her material advantages had never occurred to her. As the day progressed, Jake's patient presence began to produce subtle but measurable changes in Midnight's condition. The stallion's breathing became more regular, his responses to sound and movement more alert. These improvements were not dramatic enough to constitute medical recovery, but they suggested that something essential within the horse was beginning to respond to treatment that had nothing to do with expensive procedures or professional credentials. By the 5th day of Jake's vigil, Midnight had begun to take small amounts of water and grain, accepting nourishment with the careful deliberation of an animal testing its trust in the world. The improvements were modest by medical standards, but to Jake's experienced eye, they represented the difference between an animal waiting to die and one beginning to consider the possibility of living. Word of these changes had spread through the ranch with the speed that hope always traveled among people who work closely with animals. Jake's unconventional treatment extended beyond mere presence to include remedies that drew from a lifetime of practical experience with horse ailments. During the cool desert mornings, he gathered wild herbs from the arroyos and hillsides surrounding the ranch. Desert sage for its calming properties, mesquite bark for digestive troubles, and palo verde flowers that seemed to lift the spirits of animals recovering from trauma. These plants cost nothing but time and knowledge, yet they represented healing wisdom, accumulated through generations of men who had lived close to both land and livestock. The bundle of desert herbs that Jake prepared each morning served a purpose that went beyond their medicinal properties. The familiar scents connected Midnight to the natural world from which his confinement had increasingly separated him. Expensive stables and carefully controlled environments had provided physical comfort, but had perhaps isolated the stallion from the sensory experiences that reminded horses of their essential nature. Jake's simple remedies restored that connection, offering Midnight the wild fragrances and textures that spoke to something deeper than trained responses. Sarah Blackwood found herself drawn to these morning gatherings with an interest that surprised her. Her education had emphasized the superiority of modern scientific methods over folk remedies and traditional practices, yet she could not deny the evidence she witnessed daily. While expensive veterinarians had failed to reach Midnight despite their advanced training and sophisticated equipment, Jake's humble approach was producing measurable results through nothing more complex than patience, attention, and plant medicine that grew wild throughout the territory. "Where did you learn about these herbs?" Sarah asked one morning as Jake sorted through his gathered plants, separating leaves and stems with the careful attention of someone who understood their individual properties. Jake's hands never paused in their work, but his voice carried the reflective quality that marked conversations about the past. "My grandmother was half Apache. She taught me that the land provides everything needed for healing if you know how to look for it. Took me years to understand that she wasn't talking just about plants. She meant the whole relationship between living things and the place they call home." The revelation added layers to Sarah's understanding of the quiet man who had accomplished what medical science could not. Jake's knowledge represented a different kind of education, one earned through experience rather than acquired through formal study. His grandmother's Apache heritage connected him to healing traditions that predated the territorial settlement by centuries, wisdom that had sustained people and animals through challenges far more severe than those faced by wealthy ranchers. The veterinarian said that modern medicine had advanced far beyond such primitive practices, Sarah observed, testing her own assumptions against what she was witnessing. Jake's smile carried no criticism of the medical men who had failed where he was succeeding, but rather the gentle understanding of someone who had learned to value effectiveness over credentials. Modern medicine is fine for modern problems, but some troubles are older than that, and sometimes the old ways work better because they treat the whole creature instead of just the symptoms. Their conversations during these morning herb-gathering sessions revealed the philosophical differences between Jake's approach and the methods favored by wealthy horse owners. Expensive veterinary care focused on diagnosing and treating specific conditions, utilizing sophisticated instruments and imported medications to address problems with scientific precision. Jake's methods were more holistic, considering the animal's emotional and spiritual needs alongside physical symptoms. Where medical professionals saw a case study, Jake saw an individual whose recovery required attention to factors that could not be measured or quantified. The changes in Midnight became increasingly apparent to everyone who worked around the stallion. His coat, which had grown dull during his decline, began to show hints of its former luster. His responses to human presence became more engaged, suggesting renewed interest in his surroundings rather than mere tolerance for necessary care. Most significantly, his eyes began to regain the alert intelligence that had made him such an impressive animal before his mysterious collapse. These improvements did not go unnoticed by Harrison Blackwood, who had been preparing himself for the financial and social consequences of losing his prize stallion. The ranch owner's visits to Midnight's stall became more frequent as the horse's condition improved, though his interactions with Jake remained formally polite rather than warmly grateful. Blackwood's background in business had taught him to be suspicious of success that could not be easily explained or replicated through standard procedures. "Martinez tells me you've been spending considerable time with the stallion," Blackwood said during one of his inspections, his tone suggesting evaluation rather than conversation. "Yes, sir. He seems to respond well to regular attention," Jake replied, maintaining the respectful demeanor that his position required while offering no elaborate explanations for his methods. Blackwood studied Midnight's improved condition with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to analyzing investments. The veterinarians were quite certain that his condition was beyond treatment. "I'm curious about what you've done differently." Jake's answer reflected both honesty and diplomacy. Sometimes animals just need to feel that someone cares about them for their own sake, rather than for what they represent. Midnight's a fine horse with a good heart. He just needed reminding of that. The simplicity of Jake's explanation seemed to frustrate Blackwood, who was accustomed to complex business strategies and sophisticated solutions to expensive problems. That his valuable stallion might recover through nothing more than patient attention and wild herbs gathered from the desert challenged his fundamental beliefs about the relationship between cost and effectiveness. Yet the evidence before him was undeniable. Midnight was improving under Jake's care after failing to respond to the best medical treatment money could buy. Sarah watched these interactions between her father and Jake with growing awareness of the tensions that existed beneath their polite exchanges. Her father's world was built on measurable achievements, documented credentials, and financial investments that produced predictable returns. Jake represented something different, competence that could not be purchased, wisdom that had no institutional backing, and success that defied conventional explanations. As Midnight continued his gradual recovery, Sarah began to recognize parallels between the stallion's condition and her own experience. Like the horse, she had been provided with every material advantage that wealth could secure. Yet something essential remained unfulfilled. The finest education, the most elegant surroundings, and the most sophisticated social connections had not satisfied whatever need existed within her for authentic purpose and genuine connection. Jake's success with Midnight offered a different model for healing, one based on presence rather than possessions, understanding rather than acquisition, and love rather than investment strategies. Harrison Blackwood's gold pocket watch had become an instrument of frustration rather than mere timekeeping. He found himself consulting it frequently during his visits to Midnight's stall, as if the expensive Swiss mechanism could somehow measure and explain the impossible recovery taking place before his eyes. The watch represented everything Blackwood valued: precision engineering, foreign craftsmanship, and substantial cost. Yet it could not quantify the healing power that a penniless drifter was demonstrating through methods that defied rational analysis. 2 weeks had passed since Jake began his unconventional treatment, and Midnight's improvement had progressed beyond what any reasonable observer could attribute to coincidence. The stallion was eating regularly, responding to commands, and showing renewed interest in his surroundings. His physical condition was approaching what it had been before the mysterious collapse, yet Blackwood found himself unable to celebrate this remarkable recovery. Instead, he was troubled by implications that challenged his fundamental beliefs about the relationship between money and results. The morning meetings in Blackwood's study had taken on a different character, as ranch business increasingly focused on the mystery of Midnight's recovery. Luis Martinez reported daily on the stallion's progress, but his updates carried an undercurrent of uncertainty about how to explain what they were witnessing. The foreman's practical experience had taught him to recognize effective treatment regardless of its source, yet he struggled to reconcile Jake's success with established veterinary wisdom. "The horse is showing every sign of complete recovery," Martinez reported, his voice reflecting both relief and confusion. "His appetite is strong, his responses are alert, and his physical condition appears to be returning to normal. But I can't explain why Morrison's methods worked when professional veterinarians failed." Blackwood's frustration was evident in the way he handled his watch, flipping it open and closed with nervous energy that betrayed his internal conflict. 2 of the territory's most qualified veterinarians examined that horse. They used the latest equipment and the most advanced treatments available. Yet a hired hand with no formal training accomplishes what they couldn't. It makes no sense. "Sometimes animals respond to things we don't fully understand," Martinez suggested carefully. "Morrison has a way with horses that goes beyond what can be learned from books or medical schools. The other hands have noticed it too. He seems to communicate with them on a level that's different from normal training methods." The suggestion that intuitive understanding might prove superior to expensive expertise struck at the core of Blackwood's worldview. His success in business had been built on the principle that money could purchase the best of everything: the finest advisors, the most advanced equipment, the most qualified professionals. The idea that a penniless cowboy might possess abilities that wealth could not acquire challenged the foundation of his entire approach to life. Word of Midnight's recovery had spread throughout Copper Ridge with the speed that unusual news always traveled in small communities. The story had taken on different meanings depending on who told it and who heard it. Among the working people of the town, the miners, small ranchers, and merchants who lived by their labor rather than their investments, Jake's success represented a triumph of honest ability over purchased privilege. They saw in his achievement a validation of the practical wisdom that sustained men and women who could not afford expensive solutions to their problems. The wealthy residents of the community reacted with more complex emotions. Their social standing depended partly on the assumption that superior resources produced superior results. If a drifting cowboy could accomplish what expensive specialists could not, what did that suggest about their own reliance on costly advisors and sophisticated solutions? The questions raised by Jake's success were uncomfortable ones for people whose identity was closely tied to their ability to purchase the best of everything. At the Copper Ridge Social Club, where the town's established families gathered for their weekly meetings, conversations increasingly centered on the mystery at the Blackwood Ranch. The club's membership included the bank president, the largest merchants, and the successful ranchers who formed the community's social elite. Their discussions of Jake Morrison carried undertones of class anxiety disguised as intellectual curiosity. Blackwood hired some drifter who claims to have saved that valuable stallion, observed Charles Whitman, whose own ranch had been built through inheritance rather than personal effort. Can't understand why Harrison allows such nonsense to continue when qualified professionals have declared the case hopeless. Margaret Whitman, Charles's wife, possessed social instincts sharpened by years of navigating territorial society. Here Sarah Blackwood has been spending considerable time observing this cowboy's methods. Perhaps she's been influenced by romantic notions about noble poverty and simple wisdom. Young women sometimes develop such fancies. The conversation that followed revealed the community's discomfort with success that could not be easily categorized or controlled. Jake's achievement threatened established hierarchies by suggesting that competence might be more important than credentials, experience more valuable than education, and character more significant than financial resources. These were dangerous ideas for a social structure built on the assumption that wealth naturally led to superior capabilities. Dr. Hartley, the veterinarian whose expensive treatments had failed to help Midnight, found himself in a particularly awkward position. His professional reputation depended on the perception that formal medical training produced better results than folk remedies and traditional practices. Jake's success challenged that perception in ways that could affect Hartley's future business relationships throughout the territory. "I've examined the horse since this alleged recovery," Hartley told the social club members with carefully controlled professional dignity. "While the animal's condition has indeed improved, I suspect that his original problem was less severe than initially diagnosed. Time and natural healing processes can account for what some people are attributing to miraculous intervention." Hartley's explanation satisfied those who needed reassurance that established order remained intact, but it could not address the growing evidence that Jake possessed abilities that transcended conventional understanding of animal care. Ranch hands throughout the territory had begun sharing stories of difficult horses, gentled through patience rather than force, of sick animals restored through remedies that cost nothing but time and attention, of connections formed between man and beast that seemed to operate beyond normal training methods. Sarah Blackwood found herself caught between the social expectations of her position and her growing recognition that Jake represented something valuable that her father's wealth could not purchase. Her education had prepared her to move comfortably among the wealthy families who dominated territorial society, but it had not equipped her to evaluate the kind of practical wisdom that Jake demonstrated daily through his work with Midnight. Tension between these competing worldviews was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Jake's success challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between cost and effectiveness, credentials and competence, wealth and worth. For a community that had organized itself around the principle that money could solve any problem, his achievement suggested uncomfortable possibilities about the limitations of their shared philosophy. As Midnight's recovery continued and Jake's reputation grew, Harrison Blackwood faced a dilemma that his gold pocket watch could not resolve: how to acknowledge success that undermined everything he had believed about the superiority of expensive solutions while maintaining his position in a community that shared his values. The gold locket that Sarah Blackwood wore had belonged to her mother, a woman whose values had been shaped by frontier necessity rather than inherited wealth. Inside the delicate case, a faded photograph preserved the image of Mary Blackwood, as she had been before prosperity changed the family's circumstances. Dressed in simple work clothes, her hands showing the calluses of a woman who had contributed to the ranch's early success through physical labor rather than social management. Mary had died when Sarah was 12, but her influence remained present in the quiet voice that questioned whether wealth truly measured a person's worth. That voice grew stronger as Sarah watched Jake's continued success with Midnight and witnessed her father's increasing frustration with a recovery that defied expensive explanation. The stallion's improvement had progressed beyond mere survival to genuine vitality, his restored energy and alertness representing a triumph that should have brought celebration rather than the uncomfortable tension that now characterized daily life at the ranch. The confrontation that Sarah had been anticipating finally came during Sunday dinner, when Harrison Blackwood's patience with the inexplicable situation reached its limit. The formal dining room, with its imported china and crystal glassware, seemed like an inappropriate setting for a discussion about the value of simple kindness over sophisticated expertise. Yet Sarah found herself unable to remain silent while her father questioned Jake's character and methods. "I've been thinking about the Morrison situation," Blackwood announced, as servants cleared the main course. "While I'm grateful for Midnight's recovery, I'm concerned about the precedent this sets. We cannot have ranch hands believing that their folk remedies and unconventional practices are superior to qualified professional treatment." Sarah set down her water glass with deliberate care, recognizing that her next words would challenge not just her father's opinion, but his fundamental worldview. "Perhaps the precedent we should consider is that genuine care and understanding sometimes produce better results than expensive procedures performed by people who view animals as collections of symptoms rather than individual creatures." The silence that followed carried the weight of years of unspoken disagreement about values that had shaped the Blackwood family's approach to life. Harrison's face reflected surprise that his daughter would openly contradict his judgment, while Sarah felt the liberating fear that came with speaking truth that had been suppressed too long. "Sarah, you're romanticizing a situation that has very practical implications," Blackwood replied with the measured tone he used when discussing business matters. "Morrison is a hired hand with no credentials, no documentation of his methods, and no accountability if his unorthodox treatments prove harmful. Dr. Hartley has formal education, professional licensing, and years of successful practice treating valuable livestock." "Dr. Hartley failed completely with Midnight," Sarah responded, her voice carrying conviction that surprised them both. "His formal education and professional licensing couldn't help our horse when he needed it most. Jake Morrison succeeded through patience, attention, and what Mother would have called simple human decency. Why is that less valuable than expensive failure?" The reference to Mary Blackwood introduced a presence into the room that Harrison had not expected. His late wife had possessed an intuitive understanding of both animals and people that had contributed significantly to the ranch's early success. Yet her approach had emphasized relationship over technique, understanding over authority. Sarah's invoking of her mother's values suggested that the current conflict represented something deeper than disagreement about animal care. It reflected competing philosophies about what made life meaningful and success worthwhile. The tension in the Blackwood household was reflected throughout Copper Ridge as word of Sarah's defense of Jake Morrison spread through the community's informal communication networks. The story had evolved from simple gossip about an unusual recovery to something approaching social commentary on the relationship between wealth and wisdom. People found themselves choosing sides based not just on their opinion of Jake's methods, but on their broader beliefs about merit, class, and the sources of genuine expertise. At Murphy's saloon, where working men gathered after long days of physical labor, Jake's achievement was celebrated as proof that honest ability would eventually triumph over purchase privilege. The miners, ranch hands, and small farmers who comprised the saloon's regular clientele saw in his success a validation of their own practical knowledge and hard-won experience. Their support for Jake was both genuine appreciation for his skill and symbolic resistance to a social system that consistently favored wealth over competence. "That cowboy did what all their fancy doctors couldn't," observed Tom Murphy, the saloon owner, as he served beer to a group of miners fresh from their shifts. "Shows what a man can accomplish when he cares more about results than reputation." The sentiment was echoed throughout the working community, with variations that reflected each speaker's particular experience, with the limitations of expensive expertise. Small ranchers shared stories of veterinarians whose treatments had been technically correct but ultimately ineffective. Miners recalled company doctors who had diagnosed their injuries from textbooks rather than understanding the specific hazards of underground work. In Jake's triumph, they saw confirmation of their long-held suspicion that practical experience often produced better results than formal education. The wealthy families of Copper Ridge responded to these developments with increasing unease as they recognized the challenge that Jake's success represented to their social position. Their status depended partly on the assumption that their ability to afford the best advice, equipment, and professional services naturally led to superior outcomes. If a penniless drifter could accomplish what expensive specialists could not, what did that suggest about the value of their investments in credentials and sophistication? Margaret Whitman articulated the concern that many in her social circle were feeling, but hesitating to express directly. The working people are beginning to believe that their crude methods are equal to proper professional treatment. Such thinking could undermine respect for education, expertise, and the natural order that has served our community well. Her husband Charles nodded with the grave concern of a man who had inherited his position rather than earning it through personal achievement. If people start believing that any drifter with folk remedies can outperform qualified professionals, where does that leave those of us who have invested in proper credentials and established practices? Society depends on maintaining appropriate distinctions between educated judgment and common superstition. Jake Morrison remained largely unaware of the broader social implications of his work with Midnight, focusing his attention on the stallion's continued recovery rather than the community tensions his success had generated. His daily routine continued, unchanged. Early morning herb gathering, patient hours in conversation with the horse, careful attention to signs of improvement or setback. The simplicity of his approach stood in stark contrast to the complex social drama it had unleashed throughout Copper Ridge. Yet even Jake could not ignore the changes in how people responded to his presence in town. Working men who had previously treated him with the casual respect given to any competent ranch hand now greeted him with something approaching admiration. Wealthy residents who had barely acknowledged his existence now watched him with expressions that combined curiosity, suspicion, and uncomfortable recognition that their assumptions about class and competence might require reconsideration. The yellowed veterinary certificate lay folded at the bottom of Jake Morrison's saddlebags, beneath layers of practical items that told the story of a decade spent moving from ranch to ranch across the American West. Sarah Blackwood discovered it by accident while helping Jake organize medical supplies for Midnight's continued care, her fingers finding the carefully preserved document while searching for additional herb containers. The certificate, issued by the Colorado Veterinary College in 1876, bore the formal seal and signatures that documented Dr. Jacob Morrison's successful completion of advanced training in large animal medicine. Sarah's hands trembled as she unfolded the document, recognizing immediately that its existence transformed everything the community thought they understood about the quiet man who had saved her father's prize stallion. The certificate was not merely an old piece of paper, but evidence of a different life, a professional identity that Jake had abandoned for reasons that could only be guessed at from the careful way he had preserved this single remnant of his former status. "You were a veterinarian," Sarah said, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and confusion as Jake returned from gathering his morning herbs to find her studying the certificate. "A qualified doctor with formal training and professional credentials. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why are you working as a hired ranch hand when you could be practicing medicine?" Jake's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, resignation, and finally, the sad acceptance of a man whose carefully guarded secrets had been exposed. He set down his bundle of desert plants and moved to retrieve the certificate from Sarah's hands, his fingers handling the document with the reverence reserved for objects that carried both pride and pain. "Because Dr. Jacob Morrison failed when it mattered most," Jake said quietly. "Everything I learned in veterinary college, all the sophisticated treatments and modern procedures, couldn't save the animals that depended on me when I needed to be more than just technically competent. I gave up the title because I couldn't live with the gap between what I was supposed to know and what I actually understood about healing." The story that followed revealed a tragedy that explained both Jake's expertise and his chosen exile from professional practice. 10 years earlier, Dr. Jacob Morrison had operated a successful veterinary practice in Denver, serving the wealthy horse owners and cattle ranchers who could afford the best medical care for their valuable animals. His reputation had been built on his formal education, his modern equipment, and his ability to treat complex conditions using the latest advances in veterinary science. The crisis that ended his career had begun with an outbreak of mysterious illness among the prize horses belonging to his most important clients. Despite his extensive training and access to the most advanced treatments available, Morrison had watched helplessly as animal after animal succumbed to a condition that defied every procedure he had been taught. His professional confidence crumbled. As expensive medicines failed, sophisticated equipment proved useless, and horses continued to die under his care. "I lost 23 horses in 6 weeks, Jake continued, his voice carrying the weight of guilt that a decade of wandering had not diminished. Beautiful animals, each one representing someone's dreams and investments, each one trusting me to save them. I followed every protocol, consulted every reference, tried every treatment that medical science recommended. But I was treating the disease instead of understanding the animals, focusing on symptoms instead of seeing the whole creatures who were suffering." The revelation that had ended Dr. Morrison's career and begun Jake Morrison's wandering had come from an elderly Apache woman who worked as a stable cleaner for one of his clients. She had watched his repeated failures with the patient sadness of someone who understood something he had missed entirely. Her simple suggestion that the horses were dying not from the mysterious illness itself, but from the stress and isolation of intensive medical treatment that separated them from natural sources of comfort and healing, had proved correct when tested. "She showed me that everything I had been doing was making the situation worse," Jake explained. "The isolated stalls to prevent contagion, the constant medical procedures, the focus on treating symptoms rather than supporting the animals. Natural recovery processes. When I finally listened to her advice and moved the sick horses to open paddocks where they could access sunlight, fresh air, and each other's company, the outbreak ended within a week. The lesson had come too late to save Dr. Morrison's reputation or the animals who had died under his care, but it had begun his transformation from a technically competent professional to someone who understood the deeper principles of healing. Unable to reconcile his formal training with the wisdom he had belatedly discovered, he had given up his practice, his credentials, and his comfortable life to begin learning what veterinary college had not taught him. Sarah listened to this confession with growing understanding of the man who had quietly revolutionized her thinking about the relationship between knowledge and wisdom. Jake's choice to abandon professional success in favor of authentic understanding represented a kind of courage, that her wealthy upbringing had not prepared her to recognize. He had sacrificed security and status to pursue truth, accepting poverty and social invisibility as the price of genuine competence. "So you gave up everything to learn what you should have known from the beginning," Sarah observed. "You chose to become a drifter rather than continue practicing medicine you knew was incomplete." "I chose to start over," Jake corrected gently. "To learn from people like my Apache grandmother and that stable cleaner in Denver, people who understood animals in ways that weren't taught in medical schools. It took me years to realize that formal education had value, but that it needed to be balanced with intuitive understanding and respect for natural healing processes." The discovery of Jake's hidden credentials changed the dynamics of the situation. At the Blackwood Ranch and throughout Copper Ridge, in ways that neither Sarah nor Jake had anticipated. Word of the veterinary certificate spread with the speed that revelatory information always traveled in small communities. But its impact was complicated by the unusual circumstances of Jake's story, rather than simply validating his success. With Midnight, the revelation raised more complex questions about the relationship between formal qualifications and actual competence. Harrison Blackwood's reaction to learning about Jake's veterinary background reflected the complicated emotions of a man who had been proven wrong in ways he was still struggling to understand. The discovery that his hired hand possessed the very credentials that Blackwood had assumed were necessary for proper animal care should have resolved his concerns about Jake's methods. Instead, it highlighted the inadequacy of his own judgment in assuming that credentials automatically guaranteed superior results. "You allowed me to believe you were simply a ranch hand with folk remedies," Blackwood said when he confronted Jake. "About the certificate. If you were a trained veterinarian all along, why did you let me hire expensive specialists who couldn't accomplish what you knew you could do yourself?" Jake's answer revealed the humility that had characterized his approach to the entire situation. "Because I wasn't certain I could help Midnight any more than the doctors could. My formal training failed me when it mattered most 10 years ago, and I've been learning different ways of understanding animals ever since. I didn't want to make promises based on credentials that had already proved inadequate once before." The revelation of Jake's professional background transformed the community's debate about his success from a simple story about folk wisdom triumphing over expensive expertise to a more complex narrative about the relationship between formal education and practical understanding. His choice to abandon a successful practice in favor of deeper learning challenged assumptions about career advancement, social status, and the sources of professional competence. Dr. Hartley, the veterinarian whose treatments had failed to help. Midnight found himself in a particularly awkward position as news of Jake's credentials spread throughout the territory. The discovery that his unsuccessful rival possessed the same formal training that Hartley claimed as his primary qualification undermined his attempts to dismiss Jake's methods as unscientific folk medicine. If anything, Jake's combination of veterinary education and traditional healing practices suggested a more complete approach to animal care than either credential alone could provide. The yellowed certificate in Jake's saddlebags represented more than proof of formal qualification. It was evidence of a man who had chosen principle over profit, truth over comfort, and authentic competence over empty credentials. His willingness to sacrifice professional status in pursuit of genuine understanding had prepared him to succeed where others failed, not despite his humble circumstances, but because of the wisdom those circumstances had taught him. Midnight's original bridle hung in the tackroom like a testament to simpler times, its leather worn smooth by years of use before expensive replacements had transformed the stallion's equipment into a showcase of costly craftsmanship. Jake discovered the old bridle while searching for supplies that might comfort the horse during the final stages of his recovery, and something in its honest construction spoke to him of the animal Midnight had been before wealth and breeding. Expectations had complicated his existence. The bridle told the story of Midnight's youth, when he had been valued for his spirit and potential rather than his proven worth in dollars and breeding fees. Its simple design reflected practical needs rather than display purposes, built for communication between horse and rider rather than to impress observers with its cost and sophistication. As Jake examined the worn leather and modest hardware, he recognized that this humble piece of equipment represented what Midnight needed to reconnect with his essential nature as a horse, rather than a valuable investment. 3 weeks had passed since Jake's veterinary credentials had been revealed, and the community remained divided in its interpretation of what his success with Midnight actually meant. The discovery that he possessed formal training had satisfied some critics who needed professional validation for his methods, but it had also deepened the questions raised by his unconventional approach to healing. If Jake Morrison was a qualified veterinarian, why had he chosen to work as a hired hand? And what did his success suggest about the relationship between credentials and competence? Sarah Blackwood had spent considerable time contemplating these questions as she watched Midnight's continued improvement under Jake's care. The stallion's recovery had progressed to the point where he was ready to be ridden again, his physical condition restored to what it had been before his mysterious collapse. Yet something fundamental had changed in the horse's demeanor. He seemed more relaxed, more genuinely content than she remembered him being even in his prime condition. The expensive medical treatments that had failed to help him had been replaced by simple attention and natural remedies, but the transformation went deeper than mere physical healing. The test that would determine whether Midnight had truly recovered was scheduled for the following morning. Harrison Blackwood had arranged for a demonstration that would prove to the skeptics that his prize stallion had returned to full capability. But the event carried implications that extended far beyond mere vindication of Jake's treatment methods. The gathered crowd would include not just local residents, but representatives from throughout the territory who had heard stories about the unusual recovery and wanted to witness it for themselves. Jake spent the evening preparing for what he understood would be more than a simple demonstration of Midnight's restored health. The community had invested considerable emotion in the outcome of this situation, with different groups using it to validate their competing philosophies about success, expertise, and social hierarchy. The wealthy residents needed Midnight's recovery to be explained in terms that preserved their faith in expensive solutions, while the working people saw it as proof that authentic ability mattered more than purchased credentials. The preparation ritual that Jake followed reflected his understanding that the next day's demonstration would be as much about Midnight's comfort and confidence as about his physical capabilities. Rather than using the elaborate tack that typically accompanied the stallion's public appearances, Jake selected the old bridle with its worn leather and simple design. The choice was both practical and symbolic. Practical because the familiar equipment would help Midnight feel secure. Symbolic because it represented a return to authenticity over artifice. As Jake worked with quiet efficiency to prepare both horse and equipment, he became aware that Sarah was watching him with the intense attention of someone trying to understand principles that her formal education had not addressed. Her presence in the barn had become a regular part of his routine, but tonight her observation carried a different quality, as if she was studying not just his methods, but the philosophy behind them. "Tomorrow will determine whether everyone accepts what you've accomplished here," Sarah said, her voice reflecting both hope and concern for what the community's reaction might reveal about its values. Jake's hands never paused in their methodical care of the bridle, but his voice carried the reflective quality that marked discussions about deeper truths. "Tomorrow will show people what they're prepared to see. Some will focus on Midnight's performance and use it to confirm what they already believed about healing and expertise. Others might recognize that what happened here was about more than medical treatment. It was about treating an animal as a living creature with emotional and spiritual needs, rather than just a collection of symptoms and valuable bloodlines. The conversation that followed revealed Sarah's growing understanding of the gap between her family's approach to life and the wisdom she had observed through Jake's work with Midnight. Her father's world emphasized acquisition and control, measuring success through financial returns and social status. Jake's approach prioritized relationship and understanding, evaluating effectiveness through the authentic well-being of those he sought to help. I've been thinking about what you said regarding treating symptoms versus understanding the whole creature, Sarah continued. It seems like that principle applies to more than just animal care. Sometimes I feel like people in our social circle treat each other the same way, addressing surface behaviors while missing whatever deeper needs might be driving those behaviors. Jake's smile acknowledged both the insight and the courage it had taken for someone from Sarah's background to recognize the limitations of her inherited worldview. People and animals aren't that different when it comes to needing authentic attention rather than expensive management. Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't purchase the kind of understanding that comes from genuinely caring about someone or something for their own sake rather than for what they represent. The wisdom in Jake's observation struck Sarah with the force of recognition rather than revelation. She had always sensed these truths, but had lacked the framework to understand them clearly. Her mother's locket, worn close to her heart, seemed to grow warmer as she acknowledged how far her family had drifted from the values that had originally guided their success. Mary Blackwood had understood people and animals with the same intuitive compassion that Jake demonstrated, but prosperity had gradually replaced that authentic connection with more sophisticated but less effective approaches. Meanwhile, throughout Copper Ridge, anticipation for the next day's demonstration was building with the intensity that surrounded events that carried significance beyond their apparent purpose. The working community had made plans to attend in large numbers, viewing Midnight's recovery as validation of their belief that practical competence mattered more than expensive credentials. The wealthy families would also be well represented, though their motivations were more complex. They needed to witness the outcome that would determine whether their faith in purchased expertise remained justified. Dr. Hartley had announced his intention to attend the demonstration with several colleagues from other communities, ostensibly to observe Midnight's condition and provide professional assessment of his recovery. His presence would add medical authority to whatever conclusions the community drew from the stallion's performance, though Jake suspected that Hartley's actual purpose was to find explanations that would preserve traditional veterinary approaches from the challenge that his success represented. Harrison Blackwood spent the evening in his study, surrounded by business correspondence and financial documents that normally provided reassurance about his position in the world. Yet tonight, the familiar papers seemed inadequate to address the questions that Jake Morrison's success had raised about the relationship between wealth and wisdom. His gold pocket watch, consulted frequently during periods of stress, offered its usual precision, but could not measure the intangible factors that had proved more significant than expensive medical intervention. The ranch itself seemed to hold its breath as evening settled over the desert landscape. Ranch hands went about their duties with the careful attention that preceded important events, their conversations carrying undertones of pride in what had been accomplished and concern about how it would be received. Luis Martinez checked and rechecked arrangements for the next day's gathering, understanding that the demonstration would be evaluated not just as proof of Midnight's recovery, but as commentary on the ranch's management and values. Jake's final preparation involved a conversation with Midnight that observers might have dismissed as sentimental foolishness, but that represented the foundation of everything he had accomplished. Speaking in the low, conversational tones that had characterized their daily interactions, he reminded the stallion of his essential worth beyond any human evaluation or expectation. The horse's responses, a gentle nuzzling, alert ears, and relaxed posture, suggested that he understood both the attention and the affection behind it. As the desert night settled over the Blackwood ranch, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just Midnight's future, but the community's willingness to reconsider fundamental assumptions about competence, credentials, and the sources of genuine expertise. Tomorrow would reveal whether Copper Ridge was prepared to acknowledge that the most valuable healing had come not from expensive procedures, but from the simple gift of authentic care offered by a man who had chosen truth over comfort, understanding over status, and love over mere professional obligation. The old bridle lay ready beside Midnight's stall, its worn leather a tangible connection to simpler truths that money could not purchase, but that patient attention and genuine concern had. Proved capable of restoring. The morning sun had not yet cleared the eastern mountains when the first spectators began arriving at the Blackwood ranch. Word of Midnight's demonstration had spread throughout the territory, with the kind of anticipation that surrounded events carrying significance beyond their apparent purpose. By the time Jake Morrison led the stallion from his stall, nearly 100 people had gathered in the demonstration area, their faces reflecting the competing expectations and anxieties that had divided Copper Ridge for weeks. Jake's hands were steady as he fitted Midnight with the old leather bridle, its worn familiarity providing comfort to both horse and handler in a moment charged with community tension. The stallion's response to the familiar equipment confirmed what Jake had observed throughout their time together, that genuine healing involved returning to authentic foundations rather than adding sophisticated complications. Midnight's ears were alert, his posture relaxed, and his eyes bright with the intelligence that had made him such a remarkable animal before circumstances had overwhelmed his spirit. The handmade horseshoe that Jake had crafted specifically for this demonstration represented more than mere practical equipment. Forged during evening hours when his regular duties were complete, the shoe embodied the personal attention that characterized his entire approach to animal care. Unlike the manufactured shoes that typically equipped valuable horses, this one had been shaped by hands that understood both the individual animal's needs and the broader principles of authentic healing. Its slightly irregular surface bore the marks of careful craftsmanship rather than industrial precision. Harrison Blackwood positioned himself where his presence would be most visible to the assembled crowd, his formal attire and commanding posture, emphasizing his role as the ranch owner whose investment was being vindicated or questioned by the morning's events. Yet close observers could detect subtle signs of nervous energy in his manner, the frequent consultation of his gold pocket watch, the careful positioning that suggested a man preparing for judgment as much as celebration. His worldview depended partly on the demonstration, proving that Midnight's recovery could be explained in terms that preserved faith in expensive expertise. Sarah Blackwood stood with her father, but maintained sufficient distance to suggest her own perspective on the unfolding events. Her dress reflected the social expectations of her position, but her attention remained focused entirely on Jake and Midnight, rather than on the community leaders whose approval her father sought. The morning represented more than vindication of Jake's methods. It was a test of whether Copper Ridge was prepared to acknowledge values that her mother's memory and her own experience had taught her to recognize as more important than wealth or status. Dr. Hartley occupied a prominent position among the professional observers, flanked by colleagues whose presence was intended to provide authoritative evaluation of whatever they witnessed. His formal medical bag and serious demeanor emphasized his credentials and expertise, creating a visible contrast with Jake's simple equipment and understated manner. Yet something in Hartley's expression suggested a man whose confidence had been shaken by recent events, someone preparing to defend assumptions that no longer felt as secure as they once had. The working men of Copper Ridge had gathered in a distinct group, their weathered faces and practical clothing marking them as representatives of the community's laboring population. Their support for Jake was evident in their positioning and expressions, but it was tempered by understanding of the social forces arrayed against him. These men had witnessed enough conflicts between practical wisdom and purchased expertise to recognize that technical success did not guarantee social acceptance of unconventional methods. Jake's approach to the demonstration reflected the same principles that had guided his treatment of Midnight throughout the recovery process. Rather than rushing to display the stallion's restored capabilities, he began with gentle exercises that allowed both horse and audience to adjust to the charged atmosphere. His movements were deliberate but unhurried, his voice calm and reassuring, his entire demeanor suggesting confidence without arrogance or defensiveness. Midnight's initial responses confirmed what Jake had observed privately throughout the previous weeks. The stallion had not merely recovered his physical condition, but had rediscovered the joy that made performance a pleasure rather than an obligation. His steps were light and eager, his responses to Jake's guidance immediate and enthusiastic, his overall bearing reflecting the contentment of an animal whose deepest needs had been recognized and addressed. The crowd's reaction evolved, from polite attention to genuine amazement as Midnight demonstrated not just restored health, but enhanced connection with his handler. The horse's movements flowed with natural grace that had been absent even before his collapse, suggesting that Jake's treatment had addressed problems that expensive veterinary care had not even recognized, where previous demonstrations had showcased technical competence. This performance revealed authentic partnership between man and animal. As the morning progressed and Midnight's capabilities became undeniable, the assembled community faced a moment of reckoning that extended far beyond evaluation of animal recovery. Jake Morrison, the drifting cowboy with empty pockets, had accomplished what wealth and expertise had declared impossible, forcing everyone present to confront their assumptions about competence, credentials, and the sources of genuine achievement. The transformation in Harrison Blackwood's expression occurred during the moment when Midnight executed a flawless series of movements that would have been impressive even before his collapse. The stallion's performance transcended mere recovery to demonstrate a level of partnership with Jake that expensive training had never achieved. As Blackwood watched his prize horse respond to subtle gestures from a man he had hired as a common ranch hand, the fundamental assumptions that had shaped his worldview began to crumble with the weight of undeniable evidence. The crowd had fallen into reverent silence as Jake guided Midnight through increasingly complex maneuvers, each one executed with the fluid grace of an animal whose trust had been earned rather than purchased. The stallion's obvious contentment and eager cooperation stood in stark contrast to the mechanical obedience that had characterized his previous performances under professional trainers. Where expensive expertise had produced compliance, Jake's patient attention had restored joy to the animal's work. Dr. Hartley's professional composure finally cracked as he witnessed capabilities that his formal diagnosis had declared impossible. His colleagues from neighboring communities watched with expressions that combined amazement with professional embarrassment, recognizing that they were observing results that challenged everything their education had taught them about animal recovery and the relationship between cost and effectiveness. The expensive equipment in Hartley's medical bag seemed suddenly inadequate compared to the simple tools that had produced such remarkable healing. "This is extraordinary," admitted Dr. Fleming, the second veterinarian who had failed to help Midnight during his crisis. The animal's condition appears to be not merely restored, but enhanced beyond what I would have considered possible given his previous state. Mr. Morrison's methods have achieved something that our combined expertise could not. The public acknowledgement from a qualified professional carried weight that Jake's private success could not match, providing validation that even the most skeptical observers found difficult to dismiss. Yet Jake himself seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention, his focus remaining on Midnight's comfort and well-being rather than on the community's evaluation of his achievement. His humility in the face of triumph reflected the same character that had enabled his success, genuine concern for others rather than personal aggrandizement. Harrison Blackwood stepped forward with the deliberate movement of a man making a decision that would define his character in ways that business success never could. His gold pocket watch remained silent in his vest as he approached Jake and Midnight, understanding that this moment required acknowledgement of values that precise timekeeping could not measure. The ranch owner's formal education and business experience had not prepared him for conversations about authentic healing, but his fundamental honesty compelled him to recognize truth regardless of its source. "Mr. Morrison," Blackwood said, his voice carrying across the silent demonstration area, "I owe you an apology and an acknowledgement that I was wrong about both your capabilities and your methods. You have accomplished something remarkable here, not just in saving Midnight's life, but in restoring his spirit in ways that expensive treatment could not achieve." The public admission from Copper Ridge's most influential resident carried implications that rippled through the assembled crowd. Like wind through wheat, Blackwood's acknowledgement validated not just Jake's specific success, but the broader principle that competence could not be measured by credentials or purchased with money. His words represented a fundamental shift in perspective for a man whose entire life had been built on the assumption that wealth naturally produced superior results. Jake's response reflected the grace that had characterized his behavior throughout the entire ordeal. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your words, but what happened here was about Midnight, not about proving any particular approach superior to another. Sometimes animals need different kinds of attention than medical science typically provides. I'm just grateful that he recovered and that we found a way to reach him." The humility in Jake's response served to emphasize rather than diminish his achievement, demonstrating that his success had not altered the fundamental character that had made it possible. Unlike the professionals whose expertise had failed to help Midnight, Jake remained focused on the animal's welfare rather than on personal vindication or social advancement. His priorities had remained constant throughout the crisis, centered on service rather than recognition. The deed that Harrison Blackwood produced from his jacket pocket represented more than a business transaction. It was a tangible acknowledgement that some values transcended monetary measurement. The document conveyed ownership of a substantial parcel of ranch land, along with a formal offer to make Jake the head manager of all livestock operations. The gesture represented the ultimate recognition from a man whose wealth had always been his primary tool for solving problems and securing services. "I'm offering you a permanent position here, Jake," Blackwood announced to the gathered crowd. "Not just as a ranch hand, but as my partner in managing the finest livestock operation in the territory. Your knowledge and abilities deserve recognition and compensation that match their value." The offer represented everything that Jake Morrison had given up when he abandoned his veterinary practice 10 years earlier. Professional recognition, financial security, and social status within an established community. Yet his response would reveal whether success had altered his fundamental priorities, or whether the wisdom he had gained through suffering and service remained more important than material advancement. The new saddle that the community of Copper Ridge presented to Jake Morrison bore the craftsmanship marks of a dozen different artisans, each contributing their particular skill to create something that represented collective appreciation rather than individual wealth. The leather had been donated by Samuel Murphy, whose saloon had served as headquarters for organizing the project. The silver fittings came from Maria Santos, whose jewelry work was renowned throughout the territory. The intricate tooling had been executed by Tom Brennan, a harness maker whose attention to detail rivaled that of any craftsman in the Southwest. Unlike the expensive equipment that typically reflected the buyer's financial resources, this saddle embodied the shared values of people who measured worth through character and competence rather than monetary accumulation. Every stitch, every decoration, every carefully fitted piece represented hours of labor freely given in recognition of what Jake had accomplished not just with Midnight, but in challenging the entire community to reconsider its assumptions about healing, expertise, and human value. Jake's decision about Harrison Blackwood's generous offer had surprised everyone, including himself. After 3 days of careful consideration, he had chosen to accept the position, but with modifications that reflected his understanding of what truly mattered. Rather than becoming a traditional ranch manager focused on maximizing profits and maintaining valuable bloodlines, he would establish a different kind of operation, one that emphasized the partnership between humans and animals over the exploitation of natural resources for financial gain. "I've learned that healing isn't something you do to animals," Jake explained to Sarah as they watched Midnight grazing peacefully in the pasture where his recovery had truly begun. "It's something you do with them, through relationship and understanding, rather than control and manipulation. If I'm going to work here permanently, it has to be on terms that honor what we've learned about authentic connection." Sarah's response reflected the transformation that her own experience had produced. The young woman, who had once moved through territorial society with the polished confidence that wealth and education provided, had discovered deeper sources of satisfaction through witnessing genuine competence and authentic service. Her mother's locket had become a touchstone for values that transcended social status, reminding her daily that true worth could not be measured in dollars or inherited through family position. "Fathers agreed to let you establish your methods throughout the entire operation," Sarah said, her voice reflecting both pride in her father's growth and excitement about the possibilities Jake's approach offered. He told the other ranch owners at last week's association meeting that effective animal care required understanding that went beyond what money could purchase. The ripple effects of Midnight's recovery had indeed spread throughout the territorial ranching community, with implications that extended far beyond the Blackwood Ranch. Other livestock owners, initially skeptical of Jake's unconventional methods, had begun requesting his consultation for animals that traditional veterinary care had been unable to help. His reputation was spreading not through expensive advertising or professional networking, but through word-of-mouth testimonials from grateful clients whose animals had responded to attention that honored their individual needs. Dr. Hartley's response to these developments had been more graceful than many observers had expected. Rather than dismissing Jake's success as luck or accident, the veterinarian had approached him about collaboration that might combine formal medical knowledge with the intuitive understanding that had proved so effective. Their conversations had revealed possibilities for healing approaches that neither man could achieve alone. Scientific knowledge balanced by traditional wisdom, professional expertise guided by authentic connection. Perhaps what we need is partnership between different kinds of knowledge, rather than competition between competing approaches, Hartley had suggested during one of their planning sessions. Your understanding of animal psychology and natural healing could complement formal veterinary training in ways that produce better results than either approach alone. The collaboration that developed between Jake and Dr. Hartley represented a broader transformation occurring throughout Copper Ridge as the community struggled to integrate the lessons learned from Midnight's recovery. The rigid social hierarchies, based on wealth and credentials, were giving way to more flexible arrangements that recognized competence regardless of its source or packaging. Working people found their practical knowledge taken more seriously, while wealthy residents began to question whether their expensive solutions were actually producing the results they needed. Luis Martinez had been promoted to General Ranch foreman, his years of faithful service finally receiving the recognition they deserved. His practical wisdom about cattle and horses, previously subordinated to Harrison Blackwood's business priorities, now played a central role in ranch operations. The change had improved both the efficiency of daily work and the satisfaction of employees who felt their experience was valued rather than merely tolerated. The town's social dynamics had shifted in subtle but significant ways as people began to recognize that authentic expertise came in many forms and that valuable contributions could emerge from unexpected sources. The Copper Ridge Social Club still met weekly, but their conversations increasingly focused on practical achievements rather than purely financial success. Margaret Whitman had surprised everyone by asking Jake to help with her husband's prize mare, publicly acknowledging that results mattered more than the social status of those who produced them. As autumn settled over the Arizona desert, painting the landscape in colors that reminded everyone of nature's quiet wisdom, Jake Morrison found himself settled in ways he had not experienced for a decade. His morning routine still included herb gathering and patient attention to the animals under his care, but now these activities served the established purpose rather than temporary employment. The community that had initially questioned his methods had become his home, and the work that had once been merely survival had become a calling. Midnight grazed in the evening light, with the contentment of an animal whose spirit had been restored along with his physical health. His recovery had become legendary throughout the territory, but more importantly, it had served as proof that love offered freely could accomplish what money alone never could. The stallion's transformation from broken investment to thriving creature represented possibilities that extended far beyond animal care to encompass the broader question of how human communities could learn to value authentic connection over material accumulation. The desert stars emerged with their ancient brilliance as Jake Morrison reflected on the journey that had brought him from professional failure to genuine success. In choosing compassion over credentials, understanding over authority, and service over status, he had discovered not just how to heal animals, but how to find his own place in a world that too often confused price with value. His gift to Midnight had been patience and presence, but the stallion's recovery had given him something equally precious: the knowledge that authentic healing always began with love freely given.